Hey everyone, today we are going to be doing another video in my series on the older military surplus rifles. I have my friend Dan here. If you guys have seen the video I did on the IWI Jericho, that was his Jericho, and today he was kind enough to bring out his two Krag rifles. So these are the Krag Jorgensen 1898 models, correct?
Yes, these are model 1898.
Model 1898. So we have the full rifle here.
It says so right there.
It says, you know, if I just looked, that's all I have to do. And then we also have the NRA commissioned Carbine version. This is not a sporterized version that was done after the fact. This was a purpose-built Carbine version made by Springfield Armory, correct? So we'll go a little bit more into that later. But first, I just wanted to give you an overview of these rifles. These were the very first, and I have him mostly here as a subject matter expert in addition to these being his rifles because he knows a lot more about these than I do. Because these had a very short-lived life in U.S. military service.
1892 to 1902.
Right, and I guess I should start by saying when you hear a name like Krag Jorgensen, the first thing you probably think is not United States military issue, but these were in fact the very first smokeless powder cartridge rifles to be issued, at least in large numbers, and used by the United States military, correct?
To be standard issue.
Yeah, and so it shoots the 30-40 Krag, or 30 Army, or, you know...
That's pretty much it.
30 U.S., I think I've even seen them.
30 government.
30 government, yeah. And, again, that was the first time that the smokeless powder had been standardized for a United States service rifle. It still uses the old naming conventions as black powder. So like, was it 4570 or 3030 is the diameter of the cartridge over the amount of grains of powder. Yep. They kind of maintained that for these. So the 3040 Krag was a 30 caliber bullet sitting on 40 grains of powder. Now today we're just going to be shooting some new production Remington ammo because that's what was available locally.
Correct.
We've already done some shooting, and I have to say, it shoots pretty dang well.
It does.
We'll get to that shortly. So again, these really didn't see much service in the United States military, given that it was only from 1892 to 1900.
They had a short service life, but they saw a lot of service in the Philippines and Cuba.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you are
Spanish.
if you are familiar with the history of the Spanish-American War and like Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders, these are the rifles that they would have used.
Well, this is the rifle they...
Well, right, yeah, a more cavalry-appropriate style of the rifle. Now, these things do a lot of things different than other rifles you may be familiar with. They are not the most intuitive, I have to just readily admit, but they do also have a lot of redeeming features. So what we'll do is we'll just, I guess, bring out one of these rifles and go kind of muzzle to stock on one of these and just kind of go over the different features about it, and then we'll do some more shooting and talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sounds good.
So one thing I should just start off by saying is if you want a real history lesson on these, this is really not the video for that. There's a YouTube channel called C and Arsenal, as in C&R, Curio, and Relic, Arsenal, C and Arsenal, and I'll have a link to their channel down below. They do a phenomenal job of going over the history of a lot of these older rifles. They have a nearly 2-hour-long video building up about the Krag Jorgensen rifles here, going from the history of how they kind of originated to how they got adapted to U.S. service and to kind of getting into the 03 Springfields, which ended up being the replacement for these as far as U.S. service rifles. So phenomenal video for that. This is just going to be kind of my thoughts on these, and ultimately, you know, whether or not, in my opinion, this is something you should look to add to your collection. So with that said, let's go ahead and just start up here at the front. The front sight is a very, very thin, narrow blade. It doesn't have any ears or anything like that, so it's a pretty exposed blade up here, but it is maybe my favorite front sight that works in correlation with like a tangent rear sight back here. It is just a very, very fine, precise aiming point, and you'll see how that translates to accuracy later. We have a band up here, which is where we have our bayonet lug. So obviously, given that this was a U.S. service rifle and meant for military use, it obviously was intended to also be used with the bayonet. There was a couple different styles. We don't have any here, but you know, just for that information. Moving back, there is a sling loop up here as well as more centered here on the rifle. So yeah, as I was just being informed off camera here, this might have been added for match shooting later, just you could really kind of lock into that sling, because these were really, really popular with match shooters. And again, when we get to the accuracy portion, you might see why that might be the case. Now, moving back here, we have this rear sight. Now, this is one of the things that changed several times over the life of this rifle. I think there was like 6 different rear sight designs used, going all the way from 1892 up to I think 1901, I think, or 02 was maybe the most recent sight adaptation they made. This one is pretty unique in what it actually allows the shooter to do. So obviously you can adjust it. So first of all, we have a little ladder style here. I'll take some close-up pictures so you can see a little bit better there, so I can keep this thing pointed in a safe direction. But we have graduations up the top as well as along the side here. So we have everything from 100 yards up to 2,000 yards. Pretty standard graduations for these older rifles. They had very optimistic ideas of how far you could shoot with these. But surprisingly, we do have it go all the way down to 100, which you don't always get with some of these old service rifles. Sometimes they start at 300 yards, like on our little Carbine version over here. However, not only does it allow you to adjust for elevation, this thing also allows you to adjust for windage. So up here, hopefully you can see, we have this little knob up here, and if you push this off to the side, you can actually swing this rear sight left to right to adjust for windage. And there's little markings down here, so ideally you would be trained to know what marking meant what for whatever range you were shooting. But that's kind of a first for me. This is the first time I've ever seen a service rifle that integrates windage adjustments into a rear tangent sight like this one. So it's definitely a pretty unique rear sight as far as that goes. I don't know that I would ever want to try to use the windage adjustments. I feel like Kentucky windage is probably just going to be the best for that, because trying to sit there under fire and think, okay, enemy's 200 yards away. Let's see, it's about a 5 mile an hour left to right, so let me adjust that 1 notch over. That just seems like a lot of effort. And also, to me, it's just one more thing to get wrong in the calibration for your target, and something that, while it's still pretty low profile, could potentially get knocked and cause you to lose 0.
You know, it's possible that that was also intended for match shooting, because the Army never adopted, well, I don't know if they still do, but at the time, they were anal about match shooting. They didn't adopt a rifle that was not perfect for match shooting.
I can see that.
Which is why in World War I, even though the Model 17 was a better rifle for combat, they stuck with the 03 because it was better for match shooting.
It is a very good match shooting gun. People are still using it today for match shooting. I think there's a guy out here who competes with one. But yeah, so again, just a super interesting rear sight design, and it's kind of surprising that it is on a U.S. service rifle, although, as he pointed out, match competitions were very important to the United States military. So now that we're back here to where the action is, this is where things really start getting unique as far as rifle designs go. So, and this is where it gets kind of unintuitive to me. Maybe you can pick this up and figure out exactly what's going on back here just by looking at it, but I couldn't the first time I looked at one of these rifles. So we actually have what is called a capsule magazine, I believe. So this is a pretty unique magazine. You may be familiar with magazines where you pull the bolt back, you top load the rounds into the magazine, or you may have a stripper clip that you feed the rounds into. However, this is unique in that you could load it with the with the bolt closed. So this also has a magazine cutoff, so you could just single load it, top load it every single time, or you can just drop a rifle into this tray, and then you can load 5 rounds into it, close it up, and then it will start feeding in. This does feature a magazine cutoff. So the military doctrine at the time was to use the magazine cutoff. So even though we have a round in there, I can cycle this bolt all day long and it will not feed that round from the magazine. So what this was intended to do is, the magazine was kind of your last resort as the enemy got closer and you needed faster firing. You would just single load these magazines. Now, the rifle that was in military use before this one was the trapdoor Springfield rifle, which was a single loaded rifle. So the transition to this would be pretty straightforward for soldiers who are trained on that. They were used to single loading their rifle. So it's a pretty straightforward idea here. And magazine cutoffs were still popular and even carried over to like the 03 Springfields. So they would single load it, and then once the enemy got too close, then they could just flip over their magazine cutoff here, which did reverse itself over time with these rifles. But in this case, with it up means you're deactivating the magazine cutoff, at which point now it will start feeding from the magazine. So that's a pretty nifty idea here. Now, again, one of the things that the United States military really thought was cool about that is now you can have a round in the chamber. This thing is totally ready to go, and you can now start topping off. So let's say you beat back the enemy. They just stopped whatever their charge was. Now I can leave this thing hot and ready to go with a round in the chamber and start topping myself off here. And because of the way this is designed, I don't have to worry about peeling rounds off a stripper clip. I can just take rounds out of my pouch, however many I need, to top this thing up and feed it in there. And so far, it's from our usage and from everything I've seen, it actually works pretty dang well. Now, there is a little bit of a learning curve. You kind of have to figure out the right technique to get these things in there. Otherwise, it will start kind of jamming up. But even with like a rimmed cartridge like this one, once you figure it out, it does work pretty well. And again, that was a really big selling point for the United States military's trials when they were trying to pick out a new rifle. This was a huge, huge selling point for these. Now, one of the things that these are also really well known for is their buttery smooth bolts. Now, I had my doubts as far as the actual smoothness of these went. I was like, it's a super old rifle. It's a military service rifle, which means they had to make these in mass production. So there's no way it's that smooth. But I'll be honest, this might be one of the smoothest bolt action rifles I have ever felt, not including, brand new $5,000 totally ground up custom built rifles. This honestly competes pretty closely with those, to the point where I said this earlier when we were shooting it. Normally when I'm shooting a service rifle like this, I can tell when the magazine is empty if it doesn't have like a last round hold open type follower. I can always tell when the bolt goes really smooth all of a sudden that the magazine is empty. Now I have to start reloading. This one, it feels smooth every single time, so it's actually a little bit harder to tell when you're empty, which can be a good thing or a bad thing. I'm inclined to say it's a good thing. It means you can shoot this thing really fast, and even though it's got a straight bolt here that comes down here angled, it's still really easy to get a finger on it and start working this action really, really quick. So I have to say I was really, really impressed by this bolt. The praise that it gets is not unwarranted. Now, one of the other interesting things about the way this thing works is the ejector. Now, if you can see down in here, you can see this little rocker arm. This is the ejector. So this little arm is, when the bolt comes back, you can see it kick up like that. That's what actually kicks the round out. Now, because of that, the way that this thing ejects is very dependent on how aggressively you're cycling this bolt. If you're cycling it aggressively, it will clear itself very easily. If you're going nice and smooth or nice and slow, it will either just dribble out or maybe won't even get out of the rifle at all. So if you're in the heat of combat and you're cycling it hard, it'll get the rounds out like it needs to. If you're someone who's a reloader, which you probably would want to be if you're shooting this cartridge, it is kind of nice if you're just going to be, shooting it on a nice little bench day and just want to keep those cases nice and easy. It is kind of nice for that. And then back here, we have a flag safety, kind of similar to Mausers, or if you're familiar with those. When it's over here off to the right, it makes it so you can't actuate the bolt. And then when we're over here off to the left, obviously you can actuate the bolt and pull the trigger. The trigger is, again, surprisingly nice. There's a lot of things about this rifle that I was not expecting given my experience with other contemporary military service rifles. If you're familiar with like the Schmidt-Rubin Swiss rifles, you can tell the Swiss engineering that goes into those. This rivals it as far as how cleanly put together everything is and the way it operates, which, again, with a country like the US where things have to be built in higher quantities, granted not as much back then, not features you would expect from a US military service rifle. And I would say unparalleled. The Springfield 03 is a very nice rifle, but as far as the refinement of something like this, this thing is, again, as far as contemporary options, doesn't really have much that can hold a candle to the refinement of the action, in my opinion. Granted, that's totally subjective, but that's my opinion. So I've been talking, actually, you know what? Before I go off, I want to just show the differences between this and the carbine version we have here. Again, these were contracted by the NRA, so this was not one that was brought back into surplus and then just cut down to be sporterized. This was made by Springfield Armory, and one of the ways you can tell that is up here at the front sight. If this were one of the actual carbine, the military carbines, you would have the standard integrated front sight like we have right there. Thank you. This is attached via a band, which again you'll typically see with sporterized versions. But one of the other giveaways is right here with this front barrel band. You can see that there's this little retaining pin, and that is not something you would get in a sporterized version where they just cut down the stock. So again, if we had just cut down the stock here, you wouldn't see that band. It would literally just be one where they took the stock, cut it off about here, so you still retain this barrel band, but there's no integrated pin. Yeah, so one of the other things, as was just reminded to me, is they don't have the sling points up here at the front or here in the back because these were meant to be carried in a scabbard. You also have a carbine rear sight, and then we can see here, as opposed to the just straight grip back here, they cut it off and added this little bump out for more of like the pistol grip style,
which was really well done. You can look at that,
right? You can tell it was purpose built. It's factory done. This wasn't Bubba'd. This was done by Springfield Armory, again for the NRA, which is pretty neat. And again, everything else is going to be pretty much identical as far as the action goes. Still have that 5-round magazine that opens up here on the side. With the tray, still have the magazine cut off, still have the safety. Everything else is retained as far as the function of the rifle, just a shortened down version, which is a little bit lighter, a little bit handier, a little bit easier, say you're riding on a horse or something like that, or even hiking through the woods.
Out hunting,
yeah,
for your family.
Out hunting, trying to put food on the table. You know, again, this is why these were popular sporter rifles after they did go into the surplus market. That goes to the right.
Like just under it.
Just under it. Oh, still have the magazine cut off on. Minor details. Just under it, you say.
That's what it looks like from this perspective. Hang on.
I was holding low because of the...
There you go.
So, seems to be point of aim, point of impact.
Oh, you're knocking it around. 6 for 6? Or
5 for 5. That feels really nice.
Doesn't it?
And it's weird because I'm so used to, with the bolt action, the bolt feels smoother when there's no rounds, so I can tell the mag's empty. But this, it's so smooth on every one that I'm like, okay, I actually have to keep count in my head, otherwise I'm going to get it confused.
Isn't that nice?
I like it. So one of the other things that really sealed the fate for these things is the way that they load. So again, with the magazine cut off, theoretically you could have the bolt closed and top off, which is pretty neat. But again, at least when these things were first integrated, there was no stripper clip integration or anything like that. You had to single load each of these by hand. And during the Spanish-American War, the Rough Riders specifically complained about that. I believe during the Battle of San Juan Hill, they complained that they had to leave probably hundreds of live rounds sitting on the ground as they were going up the hill because they kept fumbling these out and they kept falling out while they were trying to load them in. So again, just to demonstrate, I have 5 rounds here, and I'm going to try to load it somewhat gingerly, but we'll see how it goes. And I'm going to just try to nose them in as best I can, and we'll see how it goes. All right, so 5 rounds in there. Now you could probably get lucky if you just kind of gravity fed them in, but I think more realistically, that's the manner that you're going to see most people reloading these if they want all 5 rounds to go in. So let's just directly compare that to something else, and we happen to have a Mauser K98 that is stripper clip fed, so let's see how that compares to this. Okay, so here we have a gorgeous example of a Mauser K98. This one was actually a Yugo capture, so it's got the Yugo crest up here. So we have a stripper clip of 5 rounds. We're going to load the same amount of rounds, and we'll see how it goes with this.
Is this the first time you've tried to do that?
With a K98, that's my first time loading it. Now I have a Yugo M48, which is going to be almost identical feeding method, but now we have 5 rounds loaded in, ready to go. So I'm just going to demonstrate that one more time, because why not, right? And with the controlled round feeding of the Mauser, it makes it a lot easier to extract these back right into my hand. All right, so once again, 5 rounds in here, and we're loaded with 5 rounds ready to go. So this is what the Rough Riders encountered, generally speaking, the Mauser action being fed by stripper clips. And they said, hey, we need that. We need something like that. And hence why, with the 03 Springfield, which replaced the Krags, geez, it's been a long day. With the 03 Springfield, which replaced the Krags, and pretty much every service rifle after that, integrated stripper clip feeding, pretty much all across the board, until box magazines became the way to feed, or end block clips with the M1 Garand. Okay, so right now I want to demonstrate the magazine cutoff really quick. So right now it's disengaged, so I'm just going to flip this thing down so it's engaged, and I have a full 5 rounds loaded into the magazine, as you might be able to see down in there. And again, I can cycle this bolt all I want, and it's not going to pick up. So what I can do is just drop around in, again for single loading. Just drop around in for, like I said, with single loading. Load it in. Oh, just realized something. I think I have my mic way down, so hopefully I don't have to reshoot everything we just did. But now with that, I can just, again, drop another one in. And now if I wanted to, I could disengage the magazine cutoff and start feeding from the magazine. Now, we knocked down our steel plate because, again, this thing has a pretty good amount of oomph with it.
Nice. And yeah, the ejector, seem to have there you go.
That was just underneath it.
It was. Nice.
I think it actually. It's a little high.
Little high.
Before we go ahead and wrap up our thoughts, I want to talk about the accuracy of these things. What I'll do is I'll roll in some footage from when we were shooting these off a rest. Because what we did first is I just shot these freehand at 100 yards, or offhand, I should say. Offhand at 100 yards. And
Hits it every time.
making really good contact. Once we figured out the hold, because again, this thing was set for 100 yards. This thing can only go down to 3. So once I figured out it was point of aim, point of impact at 100 yards, just was nailing it. And so we decided to shoot it off a rest just to see what kind of accuracy we were able to get. And other than one round, I had 4 shots within maybe 2 inches, and I'll roll on a picture. And then when you shot it, obviously you went 5 for 5. It opened up a little bit more,
Yep.
maybe to like 4-ish inches.
I'm not the best shot though.
I get a lot more practice, what can I say? But I was really impressed by the group that I shot with this. Now again, that's with newer production ammo. I don't know what the accuracy was like with the original 200 grain bullets that these things had. And again, the accuracy of yours is probably going to be very dependent on how good of a steward the previous owners were before you.
These are in good condition.
These are in really good condition, so the rifling is going a long way in keeping those groups consistent. But I was pretty impressed by the accuracy.
Yeah.
And we only shot this one for accuracy. We didn't shoot the carbine version for accuracy, just for time's sake and not burning through all of his ammo, because again, the new production stuff isn't cheap. But again, I was happy with it. So let's go ahead and wrap up our thoughts. So I've done a lot of talking, so I'm just going to let Dan start talking about what is your thoughts on these rifles.
Well, I mean, they are excellent rifles for what they are, and I can see why the Army chose them over everything else that was tested at the time. They're for what the Army wanted. They're just as good as anything else, the Mausers and the Enfields. And the selling point was the magazine. Was they liked that you could reload it without opening the bolt, and either letting dirt in or being out of commission when the enemy charges. So that's what sold the Army over a Mauser or an Enfield. And I just like them because they're interesting, cool guns.
Yeah.
And they're one of a kind. Nothing else did this. And they do it very well.
Yeah. As he said, and as we mentioned earlier in the video, the magazine feeding system is definitely one of the things that won the Army over. However, I think it's one of those things that's great in theory, but not in practice. Again, as I said, it's a really cool idea, being able to top load with the magazine cut off, be able to top off with the bolt closed. But again, we had people like the Rough Riders complaining about it when they're dumping rounds on the ground. Because, while it might be easy for us to do out here on a nice, bright, sunny Sunday afternoon, it's maybe not super easy to do when you're running up a hill or you got people shooting rounds over your head. Or
I wouldn't want to do
your
it.
buddy next to you goes down or something like that. It's going to be a lot harder. And that's why you don't see that being a requirement in any later military contracts. So, again, going straight to the 03 Springfield, top fed, stripper clip fed. And we never felt like we had to get back to being able to top it off with the bolt closed, maybe with the exception of the integration of box magazine fed rifles like the M4 or M1As or anything like that.
I mean, but even then, that wasn't a requirement. That's just a byproduct of box magazine fed guns.
Exactly. So, but it is definitely unique. It's one of those things that's just pretty nifty, pretty cool. And again, there's a lot to actually appreciate over the novelty of it. The bolt being amazingly smooth. Again, it's something I think you have to feel to understand, because when I was watching videos, I was listening to them cycling the bolts, and I was like, oh, that kind of sounds chunky. It doesn't sound as smooth as they're saying. Then I got one in hand, and it does not fail to impress.
It does not.
And the trigger matched with the sighting system gives you a lot of really good precision, which is, again, why these are really popular as sporting and competition rifles. And as you told me that they actually banned these in the competitions.
That's one of the common the Krag mythos.
Okay.
Is I can't find one way or the other, but it's something everybody says.
Okay.
So,
I mean, and
they were used for a long time, well past when they were retired in 1903 in military competition shooting.
Yeah, and again, for good reason. I was really, really impressed with what I was able to squeeze out of these rifles. And this is the first time I've ever shot one out here today. So if I had more experience and I was doing hand loads, I can only imagine.
Oh, yeah.
it would only get tighter. But I can't really ask to improve over what I shot today. So there's the novelty aspect of it, as well as the actual practical high points, as we've mentioned.
Better than a high point, though.
Absolutely better than a high point. Now, that said, it is not without its drawbacks. Again, the ammo is not super prevalent. You can find it online.
Yep.
Sometimes you can find it at your local shops, but it's not going to be the cheapest thing in the world. No. So if this is a cartridge you want to get into, I would highly recommend getting into hand loading, because it's just going to make it a lot easier and a lot more cost effective to shoot one of these rifles. Also, again, it is kind of on the slower side to load. This is definitely not a zombie apocalypse gun, as we were joking about earlier.
No.
This would not be my go-to survival gun. And even though we can be accurate with it, this might not be my go-to hunting gun either, just because I like having optics on something I'm going to be using for that, just so I can guarantee I'm getting a humane shot. But it is really fun to shoot these.
But for the people, there's definitely people who do hunt with military rifles.
Yes.
So this carbine is light, points really nice, and it's accurate
Yep.
once you get used to the sights.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people who go hunting with an SKS. I would probably rather go hunting with one of these
Yeah.
over an SKS. So just as an example of what he's talking about. And again, as far as we know, the world record elk, at least in the U.S., was taken with a 30-40 Krag.
Yep.
So it's a capable round for sure.
Yeah.
But they are really fun to shoot, and I think that's where, again, as I said at the beginning of the video, one of my things is just letting you know whether I think you should add these to your collection. It's maybe not at the top of my list, if I'm totally honest, but actually now having had the chance to handle one of these and appreciate one of these, I see the appeal and I understand the appeal, and I can see if I'm able to get lucky at a pawn shop or something someday and catch one where the guy doesn't know what he has, I can see myself adding one of these to my collection.
Yeah, especially if you're into U.S.
Yes.
Rifles. One of the best.
I mean, the first ever smokeless powder cartridge for the U.S. military. Also, one of the shortest lived service rifles.
It is
in
the
US
shortest.
The shortest service rifle in U.S. history. So it's got a couple things to its name that make it a little bit more unique.
But it was also one of the, it was designed in the 1880s, and the trial, for the U.S. version was held in 1891. So, and adopted in 1892. So, as a first kind of bolt action repeater, it is not bad.
Yeah, and again, it's leaps and bounds in technology over the trapdoor Springfields that they were shooting
Yes.
prior to this. So,
which I think is interesting that the cavalry would complain about them dropping loose rounds when they had trapdoor Springfields, which you have to drop loose rounds into.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. But again, when you're going up against like
Stripper clip
fed Mausers, I can understand why
Yes.
they're like, hey, why what? It's like if I was, shooting a K98 and I came across a U.S. soldier with a M1 Garand, I'd be like, whoa, wait, why does he get semi-automatic 8 rounds?
Yeah.
Why does he get this and I have to shoot this bolt action gun?
Reload in 1 second.
Yeah.
What's up with that?
Now, granted, K98's not a bad service rifle for the time, but there are times when you look at the enemy's rifle and you say, whoa, why don't we have that? Anyway, we're kind of getting beyond the scope of this video. So obviously, I think it's safe to say you would say add one to your collection, considering both of these are in your own personal collection.
Yes. If you find one in good condition for a good price, the problem is that the majority, a lot of them, were cut down rifles after they were surplused in the 20s and 30s. Everybody loved carbine rifles, and most of the rifles were cut down.
Yeah.
You can easily find a cut up one, not so easy to find a complete rifle in good condition.
And if you do, you're likely going to be paying for it. And
Yes.
I can honestly say I would not necessarily be opposed to getting a sporterized version because, in my opinion, the cool factors are all back here
Yes.
with the super smooth bolt, the magazine. Granted, if you can get one in the military configuration, that's always ideal. But again, if you want it to be cost effective, the sporterized version is still going to work. And I'm not a huge fan of sporterized versions in a lot of rifles just because it's the overall look that I've always found cool of a lot of these service rifles. But again, as I think, a lot of the cool stuff is still back here, and that's all going to be maintained in the sporterized rifles. But that's my 2 cents on it. Anything else you want to add about these?
I can't think of anything, just that I really love them.
Yeah, they're pretty neat.
They're a cool piece of turn of the century history.
Yes, definitely. So again, if you want to learn more about the history and development and military trials that we've kind of just scratched the surface on, check out that CN Arsenal video about these. It'll have way more information than you could ever hope to get from a Wikipedia page, for example, or any YouTube video, really. Again, it's almost a 2-hour-long video, and they have that on a lot of different firearms. So if you are a big military firearm buff, man, there's a wealth of information over there. They have 03 Springfields. They have them on a lot of stuff. If you're not a follower of their channel, definitely check it out, especially if you're a historical firearm buff. There's You will not have a want for information over there. But one thing I want to say is I appreciate Dan allowing us to fire these rifles here for your entertainment. And he has a lot of other old surplus rifles as well that we'll be hopefully getting in front of the camera here before long, including that K98. We got the M47. We got I don't want to name off all of them. There's a lot of really cool stuff that we'll be hopefully being able to run in front of the camera here before too long. So if you guys own one of these, definitely leave a comment down below. Let us know your thoughts on it, because the more information, the better. If you've always been interested in one of these, definitely let me know. And if you know of other really good quality videos out there, throw those in the comment section below so people who are interested can take in that information. I'll just go ahead and close out by saying that I do have a Patreon page, so if you do feel so inclined, go ahead and check that out. I post all my videos there early, as well as posting some exclusive content over there, as well as monthly live streams and some giveaways. So if you feel so inclined, definitely check that out. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, go ahead and throw those in the comment section down here on YouTube, as well as me uploading to Full30. So if you're watching over there, I appreciate it. If not, at least subscribe over there. I get that watching videos is not super convenient over there, but at least subscribe just in case YouTube takes my videos down, which they are not. They've set precedent that they're willing to do that with other channels before. So at least subscribe over there if you want to be able to follow my channel in case something bad happens. But anyway, with all that said, as always, I hope you're able to get something out of this video. I appreciate Dan's assistance, and I appreciate you watching.